Hi, everyone. I'm John Ghilarducci of those two names. This is Tage. We have one more person to give credit to. Luke Rawson in our office did a lot of the compiling of results and a lot of the research and writing too. So credit to him as well. The way that we've set this up, we'll do a little bit of background on the survey. We'll talk about the program and service area results, then connection charges, then stormwater rates and credits, and then environmental justice.
There you go.
So this was really fun. The project, we feel very fortunate that we got to be involved in this very comprehensive survey through the Department of Ecology, administered by the City of Tacoma. We got over 60 responses, 62 to be exact, from cities and counties with stormwater programs. Over 30 questions on stormwater rates, stormwater rate credits. We're just going to go over a select group of the results today, publicized through the Washington Stormwater Center. So thank you to them for doing that. And you see some of the content. We asked about what the programs do around the state, service areas, whether or not they charge connection charges, very specific questions about rates and rate structures, rate credits. And then maybe one of the most interesting pieces of this was the environmental justice component. How are agencies bringing environmental justice into their stormwater programs? That's where I think we learned the most. A lot of the survey responses confirmed impressions maybe we already had, but where we really learned was in that environmental justice area. We were also fortunate to work with and we are still working with the Technical Advisory Committee, a handful of stormwater practitioners with agencies, large and small. And they provided guidance to us, input, and a review on our deliverables. So this is a map of those respondents that we were lucky enough to get, and it took a while. I mentioned 30 questions, so we really appreciate that folks spent the time to go through and answer the questions. 53 cities. We had a couple of the other were, I think, sub-flood control zone districts. And then 9 counties. You see a good variety of urban and rural, and some geographic diversity among the 62 respondents. Tage will go through a little bit in a little bit more detail about those jurisdictions.
All right, thank you, John. So probably not a surprise, but most of those who submitted a survey response were phase 2, city, county, or port, and about 10% of those were phase 1. In terms of a percent of total, we got just under half of all phase 2 city, county, ports within the state. So pretty good response there. And we got nearly 80% of the phase 1 cities, counties, and ports. So pretty good response there in terms of the total that we had. In terms of the city respondents, we got quite a good range of small to large, the smallest being less than 10,000 people, all the way on up to over 200,000 for that largest respondent there on the far right. So pretty good mix of geographic area, as John mentioned with those maps, and a great mix of opportunities there with different population sizes as well. We also asked each survey respondent to self-identify as urban, suburban, or a mix of urban and suburban. So about a third urban, third suburban, and about a third mix, with a little slice there, a couple of survey respondents identifying as a rural community. And you can see off to the right there, city and county graphs there showing population in the vertical axis compared with the square mileage of the service area. So you can see not only a wide range of population, but a pretty strong correlation there with larger population being spread out over larger square mileage. So anywhere from just a few miles all the way on up to about 70 square miles for cities. For counties, there in the bottom right-hand side, you can see anywhere from maybe 0 to 50, all the way on up to over 1,600 square miles of service area. So we're pretty excited to get that range of response for this particular survey. We also asked about the age, kind of the average age of the stormwater system of those who responded. A small slice there, maybe 8%, had relatively young systems in terms of stormwater assets, 0 to 25 years. A majority were in that 26 to 50-year-old in terms of the infrastructure they had. And then maybe about 20% were a little older, in the 50 to 75 years old. We also had a survey option for greater than 75 years old, but nobody had marked that one. So we were pretty interested to learn about what types of programs were funded as a part of different stormwater utilities. And you have some pretty obvious ones in terms of water quantity, water quality, street sweeping on the right-hand side there. As we move to the left, you can see that not all utilities do this, but there's quite a few that fund retrofits, stormwater portions of transportation projects. That can come up a lot when we're doing funding studies of, we have our stormwater only projects, but what about those projects that are related to street or transportation projects? Is that okay to fund? And quite a few respondents say they do fund transportation projects that have a stormwater specific component. Then we have restoration, open space, urban forestry. That other there, we had a sort of a catch-all. If we didn't list it, give us some ideas in terms of what that might look like. Some permit compliance, habitat, education and outreach. Won't go through all of these, but asset inventory, mapping, GIS. So pretty wide range of programs that are funded within a stormwater utility program funding umbrella. We also asked, is your jurisdiction incorporating environmental justice into your planning process, into your how you maybe charge or how you spend resources within stormwater utility? Just under half said yes, we are incorporating environmental justice. Of course, other side of that, about half are not. And we provided this definition of environmental justice along with the survey. And this is pulled from a Department of Health presentation in April 2022, which combined state and federal environmental justice definition. But we did want to provide that to give context in terms of those taking the survey. What do we mean by environmental justice? And so I won't read through all of that here today, but just wanted to document what context we gave as a part of that survey. And then for those that said, yes, we do incorporate environmental justice, we wanted to learn, okay, how do you do that? And far and away, the most popular way to do that for those that took the survey were to use these mapping or indexing tools. And we'll get into that a little bit later. EJScreen from EPA is a very popular tool that communities are using to help map out in their service area certain pockets of, say, vulnerable populations or other environmental hazards, and trying to figure out if we're spending money appropriately across the jurisdiction or if we're inadvertently underinvesting in certain areas. So that was a pretty popular result. The next one was more informal efforts. Communities noted diversity, equity, and inclusion plans, or more informal, non-mapping prioritization in the CIP capital improvement program planning process. And then education, community outreach was another popular one. And lastly, one survey participant noted tree planting equity as a part of their environmental justice program. And back to John for connection charges.
Thanks, Tom. So Yeah, moving into some of the more financial questions regarding connection charges. First question we asked was, do you charge a connection charge? And by connection charge, you may know this as a general facilities charge, capital facilities charge, system development charge, all the same thing basically. As you might expect, not as common as water and sewer connection charges, but 18 of our respondents are charging connection charges. These being the one-time fees paid at the time of development by new development. These are the amounts reported. They vary a lot, from close to $100 at the low end to over $3,000 at the high end, again, among our respondents. There are some data points that we know the survey did not pick up. I mean, some of the folks we know of charge area-specific overlay connection charges in areas served by regional facilities, for example. They're not in the survey, but some of those can be pretty sizable, over $10,000 for a typical single-family residence. Oh, and by the way, these are the charges for a equivalent unit for a single-family residence. These are the charges that would apply. So moving into rates and credits, we started out real big picture here. How is your program funded? And by far and away, as you would expect, most of them reported that their basic funding is from rates. A lot of other reported funding sources, grants, connection charges we just talked about, and those obviously are for capital. The flood control zone districts have the ability to charge a rate like a municipal utility, so that may also be rate funding. Bonds, loans, again, to fund capital, the real estate excise tax, or REIT, street fund, some stormwater LIDs out there, and then, or wait, no, none. We asked about that. In the category of other, development review fees, some DOE funds, and an aquifer protection fee. Do you have any non-standard major customers? And about half and half split between those who, again, self-reported have an 800-pound gorilla as part of their customer base, and those who don't. So some of the most common large customers were school campuses, university campuses, industrial areas, ports, utilities, military bases, in some cases, and hospitals. Do you impose stormwater rates on streets or roads? This was interesting because I think that this may be a trend in the industry. I'm interested if you all think so, moving toward not charging streets. I think we would have seen more folks charging their own streets 10 or 20 years ago than we do now. The yeses here, some charge only their own city or county streets, and then others charge both their own and WSDOT. As you know, you have to charge your own streets in order to charge WSDOT for state highway impacts. But almost 80% not charging streets. How does the rate get billed? So there's about 30% using outside agencies. Most of those are using counties, and presumably those are being billed on the property tax statement. 70%, as you see, do their own billing through utility billing. Usually those are cities or counties that have other utilities, and it's convenient to add them to the utility bill. Types of rate structures. So again, this one was one that maybe confirmed a little bit what we suspected, but by far and away, most of the stormwater rates out there are being charged based on impervious surface area, that what we're calling density of development, in which the rate is charged on the gross parcel area, but the rate varies by the intensity of development, by the percent coverage. Those are a form of impervious rate. What we're calling the impervious area charge is one in which the charge is applied based on an equivalent unit, and usually that is, almost always, that is the average amount of impervious surface area on a single family residence in that jurisdiction. So those go by a variety of names: ESU, equivalent service unit, equivalent residential unit, equivalent dwelling unit, impervious unit, but they're all basically the same thing. And as you see there, almost 80% of the respondents are using that type of an approach to charge for stormwater. A couple of others, maybe only one, in which they're charging based on it's associated with the water bill, and they reported that they're soon to change to an impervious basis. So one of the things we were really interested in too is that ESU or ERU value. In a lot of the more recent work we've been doing, we've either been asked to refresh that ESU number. What is the average, the new average of amount of impervious on a single family residence? And we're finding that that number is trending up. You know, whenever we look at it again, it seems like it's a bigger number than the one that's already in place, which can be awkward to implement if you're going to make that change, because it reduces your denominator and the unit rate goes up in order for that rate to become more equitable. So we find many clients say, you know, maybe it's good the way it is. But you see a pretty good range of ESU or ERU values here, from between 2,000 and 2,500 square feet of impervious up to almost 4,500 square feet of impervious, and everything in between. So the average among the respondents, as you see there, about 3,200 impervious square feet. We asked folks when their last rate increase was, and over half reported that they increased rates last year. Some more fairly recently, and then the proud 7% that it's been a much longer time since they've raised rates, and probably not unexpected. When did your stormwater program last change its rate structure? Again, over half have never changed the rate structure. So they believe they got it right at the time of initial implementation, and they haven't had to revisit the rate structure. Almost 30% have looked at it within the last 10 or 12 years there, from 2011 to 2021, and a few in the last couple of years. Our rate credits offered. There are a number of different types of rate credits, and we list those on the right side here. Low income senior, low income disabled, low income rate credits. The permissive rainwater harvesting system rate credit is required by law up to or at least 10% for that. So I suspect that a lot of the folks who reported no actually have that credit, but it's not something that they've implemented by policy, so they may not even be considering it. They rate credit. Water quantity, water quality facilities on site, mitigation, infiltration, low impact development, and then there are school credits still out there. So any of these qualified as a yes in the survey, but still almost a quarter of folks not providing rate credits. So we asked, are there any changes to the stormwater program or rate and credit structure that you would like to change? And these are among the responses that we got. Changing to that equivalent unit approach, presumably from the density of development approach, or we saw the one water consumption approach. Considering incorporating a connection charge, looking at a surcharge or extra charge within the NPDES boundary, so that this is applicable in counties in which there's an urban portion of the unincorporated county that might warrant a surcharge of some type. Swim fee surcharge for heavily developed properties with inadequate flow controls. And we've seen a few of these too, rate penalties instead of rate credits, possibly bringing in credits for BMPs, increasing credits for infiltration, eliminating the rate exemption for schools because it's so difficult to administer, eliminating the rate credit program altogether. We've had a number of these recently. We're finding that many of the rate credit programs are surprisingly underutilized. Very few people are applying for them, and so agencies are just doing away with the programs. Updating the equivalent unit value, we talked about that. That's a little bit of a be careful what you wish for at times. Auditing the impervious surface area on which the rates are based. This can be free money if you want to go in and look at audit your own billing system and making sure you are capturing all the impervious surface area that's in your agency. And then of just the fact that stormwater rates aren't recovering costs, fully recovering costs, and there may be a need for it. So we also asked about when do you plan to revisit your rates, either the structure or the levels of rates. When do you need to look at how much additional money you might need. So in answer to that rate structure question, that's the pie chart on the left. Almost 40% don't have plans to revisit the rate structure, 44% in the next couple of years, and then you see 11 and 6%, sort of somewhere in between, no immediate plans to come back and look at the rate structure. That rate level, that's more about how much money is needed, and majority there, more than 2/3 are going to be looking at that in the next couple of years, as you would expect, especially when we're seeing cost escalation like it's been. It's really important to keep up with escalating costs. And then we asked, what are examples of effective education and outreach that have worked in your locations? And we got a variety of responses here, as you would expect. A dedicated website for stormwater rates, direct mailings, bill inserts, social media, council meeting presentations, virtual open houses, frequently asked questions, answers to frequently asked questions, making sure to explain what people are buying, the tangible benefits of each program area, using pictures and making sure that you show before and after problems have been solved, promoting the impact of stormwater management on specific waterways and water bodies. This is really important if you're doing something for the sake of water quality in a lake or another important receiving water. That can really resonate with people. Having a customer review panel. We have, this is a specific answer. They sent out an individualized letter to those folks whose rates would be going up substantially to warn them and get their input. Again, that second bullet on the right is all about making sure people understand what they're buying with the stormwater rate. And that's really important. This is a hard service for people to get their arms around at times. Education regarding the rate structure. This is done at the beginning of each year for this agency. And then making sure people understand the regulatory drivers behind these needs. Okay, environmental justice.
Thanks, John. So part of the same project, phase 1 was the benchmarking survey. Phase 2 was more of a national research in terms of environmental justice. What are different utilities across the country doing to address either through rate structure, rate credits or discounts, or how they spend the money, program prioritization. I'm trying to come up with different options and documenting them here, so just you have some idea of what others are doing across the country. Marita here helped out a lot with structuring this research, along with Angela. She's at King County now, but wanted to thank them for their input in this part of the process and try to help guide this research. But yeah, the 3 items off to the right there, we'll define those a little bit more. We've talked about rate structures already, but that's how different utilities will collect the money. Rate adjustments, more about how we adjust the rate structures for different types of customers. And that bottom one, we'll spend the most time on program prioritization. That seemed to be the most popular, most impactful in terms of how utilities can address environmental justice without, as we'll get into in the next slide, some of the limitations that utilities might face in terms of legal constraints with how you use rate structures or rate credits. Well, there's a lot of text on the screen here, but wanted to have an opportunity to document some of the things to keep in mind when you're setting up a rate structure. That top box there really boils down to that there needs to be a rational nexus between what you're charging and what the services are provided. And so, notably in Teeter v. Clark County, there's, they found in that court case, only an indirect linkage is needed for at least a stormwater rate. But something to keep in mind when you're trying to evaluate how can we incorporate and consider environmental justice in our rate structures, still need to keep in mind there is that rational nexus that needs to be there in terms of having a connection between rates and services provided. That middle box there is from the American Water Works Association, the rates and fee manual for water utilities, but can apply to different, wastewater and stormwater utilities as well. And they also note in that manual, in particular, the charge needs to be based on the cost of providing the service and be related to some level of frequency or level of use in terms of how customers either receive the benefits or the burdens they produce within the utility service area. And then lastly, court case from 1995, Covell v. Seattle, there were 3 tests that they noted in those documents in terms of whether something was a tax versus a rate or a fee. And so one of those was whether the purpose of the, in this case, fee was to recover the cost or to regulate. So if it's to recover the cost, that's on the side of a rate or a fee. If it's simply meant to regulate, then that would be more on the side of a tax. Another important item is when you collect the money, are you accounting for it separately in its own, say, enterprise fund, for example? So you're collecting it to recover a particular set of costs. You're tracking it separately from, say, the general fund to be spent specifically on the authorized purpose. And then lastly, there needs to be some type of relationship between consistent with up above, the service received, or the burden produced. So with that in mind, there are some particular issues of trying to address environmental justice through the rate structure. And in fact, we did not find any specific rate structure in our research that tried to address environmental justice specifically. Although, as we noted earlier in that definition of environmental justice, fair treatment of all people is one of those tenets of that definition. And some rate structures do a better job at treating all customers fairly. And in particular, we found quite a few examples of differences of how utilities charge single-family customers. So across the country, even in Washington State, it's fairly common for utilities to charge single-family customers uniformly. Whether you're a small house, big house, you all get the same monthly rate, for example. More and more utilities are considering some type of tiered single-family residential rate structure. For example, small, medium, large. In some cases, there's no cap. It's sort of once you exceed this impervious threshold, it's variable. So we'll get into a couple of examples of what that looks like. So to the extent that impervious footprint or house size correlates with low-income populations, we didn't test this assumption too much, but there could be a connection there that allows you to sort of achieve some of these environmental justice objectives through the rate structure itself. So a couple of examples on the top left, Lake Whatcom Stormwater Utility. They have 3 rate classifications for single family customers. They have a small, medium, and large with clear definitions of how you would fall into each of those tiers. On the bottom right, Des Moines, Washington, they have multiple tiers as well, but you see anything greater than 7,500 impervious square feet, it basically turns into a variable rate. So those that have a much larger impervious footprint, even within that single family customer class, they'll get a more proportional charge than under a uniform approach. There's a little bit more involved in terms of setting up this tier structure, just in terms of data gathering, particularly for customers that you don't have information for. For single family customers, it does require some type of aerial imagery analysis. And that's why a lot of utilities will charge single family customers uniformly. There's a lot of data to gather. You got to keep up with the data, keep up with development. But if you set up the process and have some sort of review process every few years, it can provide a more fair way to charge single family customers. And as these monthly bills get higher and higher, we're seeing typical single family bills in the $15 to $20 per month range. That can become more important to make sure that you're charging all customers more fairly and more proportionally to impervious area and the impacts that has on the systems. So those rate structures, moving on to rate adjustments. In this one, we're going to be focusing on low income discounts, and Washington State does grant the authority for utilities to provide some type of low income customer assistance program. So we wanted to note a couple of RCWs, the revised Code of Washington references there. Won't go through all this in detail, but wanted to have that in the slide packet if you wanted to look into that a little bit later in terms of justification for a low income program. John mentioned earlier, as a part of that benchmarking survey, some utilities will have a low income senior discount, some will have a low income disabled discount. Some utilities have just a blanket low income discount that can reach more customers that may not fall within the low income senior or low income disabled group. So that's something to evaluate about your program. Are you reaching the largest group of low income customers? If you're only offering it for senior and or disabled low income customers, you may be inadvertently ignoring a part of the service area. Another thing that we've seen in terms of eligibility, some positives of piggybacking off of other assistance programs. So if there's a property tax exempt through county taxes, or if there's SNAP or supplemental nutrition assistance programs, if a customer comes in and presents, we qualify for this program, we could automatically enroll them into the utility low income discount program. So that helps reduce some of the administrative burden of trying to enroll customers and reduce that level of burden to apply. That middle bullet there is something that I think we've seen more interest of late. Traditionally, these low income programs are for single family customers, typically that are homeowners. What this can do though is ignore those customers that may be renting or some type of apartment or multifamily structure. And we've seen quite a few cities consider and even implement having some type of multifamily low-income program. In this case, it would not be a discount because they don't pay their utility bill directly. They might be paying it to a property owner or some type of homeowners association. And in this case, we have an example in the City of Bellevue. They have a multifamily utility rebate program. And so instead of having a discount on the utility bill, they'll actually send out checks once a year as a part of this multifamily rebate program. It's a pretty rigorous application for the City of Bellevue in particular, but I think that can be important as if you're sending out checks versus providing a discount, you want to make sure that those customers are submitting the right qualifying documents. And then lastly, there are a few cost considerations. Anytime you provide a discount, it can create the opportunity for a subsidy for other ratepayers. So we just recommend that if you do have a low income program, that you consider sources external to the utility. It could be through grants, could be through community programs or other customer donations, or even a city or county general fund as an example. And just want to make sure that as you're considering this type of a program, that you're taking into account the staffing level that might be needed to run this program, making sure you're doing appropriate outreach to make sure you're reaching those customers that might qualify, and then considering any billing system adjustments, there might be some programming costs to incorporate this type of discount. Going more nationally, we did find a couple of examples of some pretty interesting rate adjustments. In this case, Minneapolis, they have a residential stormwater credit. And typically, especially in Washington, we don't see single-family residential stormwater credits very often. There are low discounts, but in terms of on-site activities, we don't see this very often, but they have anywhere from 35 to 45% credit for customers that have different types of on-site facilities like a rain garden, green roof, or have some type of stormwater reuse. And that higher credit, that 45% credit, are for what they call green zones. And those are neighborhoods that have impacts of environmental pollution and or racial, political, and economic marginalization. So they try to have this type of program set up and incorporate that environmental justice component in their rate credit range there. Philadelphia has an income-based cap. It's on the far left there. If you are in the 0 to 50% of the federal poverty level, or FPL, your monthly bill is capped at 2% of monthly income. And kind of stepping towards the right in the middle there, if you're 101 to 150% of the federal poverty level, your monthly bill is capped at 3% of monthly income. So it's a pretty interesting approach to combining household income with the utility bill. You want to note, if you were to consider something like this, important to coordinate with your legal counsel in terms of what might be allowed in this state might be different than what's allowed in other states. And lastly, program prioritization, and this is one we found to be the most impactful. We've talked about the rate structure, the rate credits, how utilities collect the revenue. This particular section focuses on how utilities spend their revenue. So we have a couple of examples here of that. We noted a little bit earlier, this EJScreen tool, it's from the EPA, and it's an online free mapping tool. We just pulled up the City of Ghilarducci here because we're here on site, but there's a lot of different indicators, 12 environmental ones, 7 demographic ones, and then 12 environmental justice indexes that you can apply different filters and overlays on this free online mapping tool. And we've seen a lot of communities use this in their CIP prioritization process to evaluate where there's a need stormwater wise and where there's a need in terms of environmental justice, and seeing if those two items can meet in terms of being, say, one of the scoring factors for a capital project prioritization process. So City of Renton is one example. Provided a couple of links down there at the bottom if you wanted to do a little bit of additional research if you have this packet a little bit later when they publish that online. But they've used the EJScreen tool with other examples to have some type of combined equity index. And so what they've done is they've used that EJScreen tool as one of the scoring factors in their prioritization process for these programs. And they look at different parts of the city that have had or do have some type of environmental hazard, whether that be air, land, or water pollution, looking at different areas that lack opportunity for public participation or other socioeconomic factors. So I thought that was a pretty interesting in-state example of how communities are using these types of tools to evaluate their capital planning process. This one, out of state, Montgomery County. This one is pretty interesting. They have a policy goal to have 33% or a third of their projects to be in the medium to high range of a demographic index. So looking at these maps here, on the far left, you have the suitability map in that green text there. And that looks more at the improving the biology, the ecosystem, the functions of the stormwater utility. On the far right, that's a heat map that takes into account minority status and income status. And those feed into that middle map, that purple section there. It's called the sustainability map that takes into account stormwater management and these income and minority status factors to put together a combined map. And that's where they want to fund 33% of their projects in these areas where there's that crossover need for stormwater management, but also these environmental justice types of considerations. Another example, this one's a sewer utility in Northeast Ohio, but thought it was pretty interesting, wanted to include it here. They've identified certain environmental justice areas within their service area based on population type and or income levels. And then they've looked at when they're prioritizing capital projects, environmental justice is a co-benefit. So they look at different ways where projects can reduce combined overflows, taking, say, abandoned or vacant brownfield properties and transforming them into safe, maintained green spaces, and the impacts that might have, say, on property values due to these different amenities that accomplish multiple purposes, stormwater management, but also helping out in the community where there's certain areas that are identified for environmental justice.